The moment my son-in-law walked into the conference room without knocking, I knew the meeting wasn't going to be about quarterly projections. He didn't look at me when he sat down, didn't acknowledge the 23 years of work hanging on the walls around him, the framed patents, the award plaques, the company's first signed distribution contract mounted in a shadow box that I'd paid for out of my own pocket. He pulled out his laptop, opened it, and started typing before the door even finished closing. My name is Len Calloway. I was 57 years old and I had spent more than 2 decades building Calloway-Merritt Logistics from a 3-truck operation in a rented warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, into one of the Midwest's largest regional freight and supply chain companies. We had contracts with 4 major automotive manufacturers, 2 hospital systems, and the government cold chain agreement that had taken me 11 months of meetings to secure. I knew every driver by name. I knew which dock workers had kids in college. I knew which clients called on Fridays because they were nervous, and which ones called on Mondays because they actually had problems. My son-in-law's name was Bryce Harmon. He was 31. He had an MBA from Vanderbilt and a handshake that felt like he was doing you a favor. He married my daughter Cassie 4 years earlier. I'd liked him well enough at first, confident, sharp, dressed well. Cassie seemed happy. When he started talking about wanting to get into the business, I thought it made sense. Keep it in the family. Give him a chance to learn from the ground up. I should have paid more attention to how he defined ground up. He didn't start in dispatch. He didn't spend 6 months riding with drivers or learning the warehouse management software. He came in as Director of Strategic Development, a title I created for him, which in hindsight was my first mistake, and within 18 months he was sitting in on board meetings suggesting efficiency pivots and quietly building relationships with the 2 outside investors who held a combined 30% stake in the company. I watched it happen slowly, the way you watch a weather system you keep telling yourself will turn south. The first sign I should have taken seriously came 14 months before that conference room meeting. Bryce came to my office with a presentation, actual slides, 22 of them, about what he called modernizing the Calloway-Merritt operational identity. What that meant, once you stripped away the MBA language, was replacing our owner-operator model with an algorithm-driven dispatch platform, cutting the senior logistics coordinators who had been with me for over a decade, and outsourcing our compliance and safety review to a third-party firm in Atlanta. I told him no. I explained why. He nodded, said he understood, and left. What I didn't know was that he'd already shown those slides to one of our outside investors. The second sign came 6 months later at Cassie's birthday dinner. We were at a restaurant in German Village, the kind of place with exposed brick and a wine list that goes on for 4 pages. Bryce was talking about some logistics conference he'd attended in Chicago, and at some point he said almost casually, "The industry's moving past the relationship model, Len. The companies that survive the next decade are the ones that stop depending on people and start depending on systems." I remember setting down my fork. I remember Cassie looking between us. I said, "The reason we have the hospital contracts is because when St. Maid, Vincent's had a cold chain failure at 2 in the morning, I personally drove to the facility and coordinated the replacement shipment. A system doesn't do that." He smiled. The kind of smile that means he'd already stopped listening. I should have understood right then what was coming. The meeting in the conference room happened on a Tuesday in March. It was just the 2 of us, which was unusual. Bryce typically brought someone with him, his assistant, or one of the analysts he'd hired over the past year. This time, he came alone. He opened by saying the board had reviewed the company's long-term positioning. He used the word restructuring 4 times in the first 2 minutes. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a separation agreement. He said the company was moving in a new direction. That my management style, while valuable in the early stages, wasn't compatible with where Calloway-Merritt needed to go. He said the board had voted. He said this was effective immediately. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at him. He still wasn't meeting my eyes. I said, "You went to the investors before you came to me." He said, "The board made a unanimous decision." I said, "There are 4 board seats. You have one. I have one. The 2 outside investors hold the other 2. You needed both of them to do this." He said, "Like I said, it was unanimous." I sat there for a moment. 23 years. The first truck I'd bought had been a used 2001 Freightliner I'd found through an ad in the back of a trade magazine. I'd driven it myself for the first 8 months because I couldn't afford a second driver. I'd built the client list by showing up in person, by being available, by doing what I said I would do. I had given this company everything I had, and the man sitting across from me had been alive for 31 years, half of which he'd spent in school. I picked up the separation agreement. I folded it once lengthwise. I set it back on the table. I said, "I'll need to review this with my attorney." He said that was fine, that legal had already reviewed it, that it was straightforward. I stood up. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. I looked around the room, the patents, the plaques, the shadow box, one more time. Then I walked out. I didn't say another word. My phone started ringing before I reached the parking garage. I didn't answer. I sat in my car for a long time. I wasn't thinking about the money. The severance offer was decent, I knew that. What I was thinking about was something else entirely, something I hadn't thought about in years because I'd never imagined I would need to. I was thinking about a phone call I'd had with my attorney, a man named Wesley Pruitt, 11 years earlier. Wes and I had known each other since our 30s. We'd done a lot of business together over the years. Incorporation, the original operating agreement, the debt restructuring when we expanded the fleet in 2016. When I'd brought in the outside investors, Wes had drafted the shareholder agreement. And buried inside that agreement, in a section that had taken us 3 weeks to negotiate, was a clause that I'd insisted on, and that the investors had eventually accepted because, at the time, they hadn't thought it would ever matter. The clause said this: if I was ever removed from my operational role at Calloway-Merritt without documented cause, without evidence of financial misconduct, gross negligence or criminal activity, then my ownership stake in the company's core operating license reverted to me personally. Not to the company, not to the shareholders, to me. The operating license wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the foundation of every contract we held with the automotive manufacturers, with the hospital systems, with the government cold chain program. You couldn't operate the business without it. You couldn't transfer the contracts without it. It had been issued in my name originally, before the company was incorporated, and when we restructured the ownership, Wes had made sure the reversion language was airtight. I had not thought about that clause in years because I had never believed anyone would try to remove me. I had never believed my son-in-law would go to the investors. I had never believed the people I'd built this company with would vote to push me out. I had been wrong about a lot of things. I drove home. I went to my home office, the small room off the hallway that Cassie used to call Dad's cave when she was a teenager, and I opened the filing cabinet in the corner. 3rd drawer. Behind a folder of old tax returns and some vehicle titles from trucks we'd retired years ago, there was a manila envelope, plain and unsealed, with WP Original Operating Agreement, personal copy, written on the tab in my own handwriting. I pulled out the shareholder agreement, found the clause, read it 3 times. Then I called Wes. He picked up on the 2nd ring. I told him what had happened. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then he said, "Len, tell me exactly what they gave you as the reason for termination." I said they hadn't given me one. The separation agreement said, strategic realignment of leadership. Nothing about cause, nothing about misconduct. Another pause. He said, "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any communications from the company without running it through me first. And give me 48 hours. I said, "Does the clause still hold?" He said, I'll call you Thursday morning. Those 2 days were the longest I'd had in years. Cassie called twice. I didn't know how much she knew, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation. My phone showed 11 missed calls from Calloway-Merritt's general number by Wednesday afternoon. Probably the operations team realizing things were breaking down without me. I'd spent 2 decades being the person everyone called when something went wrong. Old habits don't disappear just because someone slides a piece of paper across a table. Wednesday night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake going through every conversation I'd had with Bryce over the past 2 years, pulling out the moments I'd missed, the questions he'd asked about the license structure. The afternoon he'd spent in the archives room, he'd said he was looking for old client contracts. The way he becomes suddenly very interested about 8 months ago in how the government cold chain agreement was structured and what it would take to transfer it to a new entity. He'd been planning this for a long time. I just hadn't seen it because I hadn't wanted to. Thursday morning, Wes called at 7:45. He said, "The clause holds. Termination without documented cause triggers the reversion. I've already had a colleague in corporate law review the language and he agrees. You want to move forward?" I sat down at my kitchen table. The same table where Cassie had done her homework in high school, where we'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner every year until she and Bryce started hosting it at their place instead. I said, "What does moving forward look like?" He said, "We send a formal notice to the board that the reversion clause has been triggered. We file to reclaim the operating license in your name. At that point, the company cannot legally operate under its current contracts until the ownership of the license is resolved. That puts you in a very strong negotiating position." I asked him how long it would take. He said the notice could go out today if I wanted. I said, "Send it." What happened over the next 3 weeks was something I hadn't fully anticipated, even though Wes had warned me it would be disruptive. The moment the notice landed with the board, everything stopped. The automotive contracts went into a review hold because the client's legal teams immediately flagged the license dispute. The hospital system sent formal inquiries. The government cold chain program issued a notice of potential breach, which triggered a compliance review. Bryce called me 4 times in the first 24 hours. I let them all go to voicemail. The messages started formal and ended somewhere between frustrated and alarmed. The investors called Wes directly. He told me they'd been, in his words, extremely motivated to resolve this quickly. I did take one call that week. From the company's longest-serving operations manager, a man named Chuck Devereaux, who'd been with me since year 3. He didn't say much. He just said, "Whatever you need from us, Len, you know that." I told him to hold tight. The board requested a meeting at the end of the 2nd week. I showed up with Wes. Bryce was there, along with both investors and their respective attorneys. It was the most people I'd been in a room with since I'd walked out of that conference room 3 weeks earlier. Bryce looked at me for a long moment when I came in. I couldn't read his expression. I sat down across from him, the same way he'd sat across from me, and I waited. The investors' lead attorney opened by saying they believed there had been a misunderstanding about the nature of the leadership transition. I let Wes respond to that. Wes said there had been no misunderstanding. The clause was clear. The separation had been executed without documented cause. The reversion had been triggered. The operating license now belonged to me personally. There was a lot of legal back and forth over the next hour that I won't detail here. What it came down to was this: without my cooperation, the company could not operate. Without the operating license, the contracts were at risk. Without the contracts, there was no company. The investors had committed capital based on those contracts. They stood to lose everything if the dispute dragged into litigation. At one point, one of the investors looked directly at Bryce and said, "This clause was in the original agreement. You reviewed this agreement before we voted." Bryce said he hadn't anticipated the reversion language being enforceable in this context. The investor didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. By the end of the 3rd week, we had reached a negotiated resolution. I was reinstated as chairman and CEO. The operating license remained in my name, with contractual protections added to prevent any future attempt at removal without cause. Bryce resigned. That part was quiet and handled through attorneys, and I have not spoken to him since. The two outside investors retained their stakes but agreed to updated governance provisions that gave me effective veto power over any future leadership changes. The company was not renamed. It didn't need to be. The name had always been mine. Chuck called me the night the agreement was finalized. He said the drivers had heard through the grapevine that I was coming back, and there had been something close to a celebration in the break room at the Columbus terminal. I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked him and got off the phone quickly because I wasn't sure I could hold my voice steady. There's something I've thought about a lot since all of this happened. Not about Bryce, and not about the investors, and not even about the clause that saved everything I'd built. What I think about is the phone call I had with Wes 11 years ago when we were drafting that shareholder agreement. I remember Wes had pushed back on the reversion clause. Not hard, but he'd said something like, "Len, you're going to make them nervous with this. They might walk." And I'd said, if they walk because they won't agree that I can't be pushed out of my own company without a reason, then they're the wrong partners. And Wes had gone back to them and negotiated until they agreed. I almost didn't insist on it. I almost let it go because I didn't want to make the deal harder than it needed to be. I almost trusted that the people I was bringing in would always act in good faith. I'm glad I didn't. Here's what I know now that I wish I'd understood at 30. The contracts you sign when things are good are the ones that protect you when things go bad. The relationships you build with the people on the floor, the drivers, the dock workers, the coordinators, those are not soft assets. Those are the real infrastructure. The MBA presentations and the pivot strategies and the efficiency platforms mean nothing if the people who actually run the operation don't trust the person leading it. Bryce was smart. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't incompetent. He just made the mistake of thinking that institutional knowledge was something you could replace with a software dashboard. He thought the company could run without the person who'd spent 2 decades building every process in it. He thought the clients who called me by my first name would stay out of obligation rather than relationship. He was wrong about all of it. I'm back at my desk now. The framed patents are still on the wall. The shadow box is still there. I added one thing since I returned. A copy of that shareholder agreement, specifically the page with the reversion clause, in a simple frame next to the window. Wes thought that was a little much. I told him it was a reminder, not for anyone else, for me. Keep your name on what you build. Know what you signed. And never ever assume the people who benefit from your work understand what it actually cost you to create it. I keep coming back to that filing cabinet. 3rd drawer, the manila envelope sitting behind a stack of old vehicle titles like it was nothing, like it wasn't the thing that saved everything I'd spent 23 years building. I didn't put it there as a weapon. I put it there because Wes told me to protect myself, and I listened, even when part of me thought I was being paranoid. Even when I believed, genuinely believed, that the people I brought into this company would always act with the same integrity I tried to bring to it every single day. That belief wasn't stupidity. I want to be clear about that. Trusting the people around you isn't a flaw, but trust without documentation is a different thing entirely. And the version of me that negotiated that reversion clause 11 years ago understood something the more recent version of me had started to forget. That integrity is something you demonstrate through what you build and protect, not just through how you treat people in the good years. Bryce wasn't wrong that the industry was changing. He was wrong about what couldn't be replaced. He looked at the company and saw processes, contracts, revenue lines. He didn't see the decade of early mornings that produced those contracts. He didn't see the relationships that kept clients from walking during the 2019 freight disruptions, or the judgment calls that a dispatch algorithm would have gotten wrong. He saw the building and assumed he understood the foundation. That's the kind of intelligence that comes without wisdom, sharp enough to identify opportunity, but not seasoned enough to understand cost. What I had to learn, and it took getting pushed out of my own company to fully understand it, is that perseverance isn't just about working hard. It's about working deliberately. It's about asking, every few years, whether the protections you put in place still fit the reality you're living in. I had stopped asking that question. I got comfortable. And comfort, for a founder, is sometimes the most dangerous thing there is. The clause saved me, but the clause didn't come from luck. It came from a version of myself that refused to sign away his life's work without a guarantee, even when signing would have been easier. Even when the investors pushed back. Even when I was tired of negotiating and just wanted the deal done. That version of me did the right thing, and the right thing compounded quietly for 11 years until the day I needed it. Chuck called me after everything was settled. He didn't say much, just that the Columbus terminal had been a different place the past few weeks, and the people were glad things were back to normal. I got off the phone fast because I didn't want him to hear that I was struggling to hold it together. That call mattered more to me than the legal victory. Those people, the drivers, the dock workers, the coordinators who'd stayed through all of it. That's what the company actually was. Not the license, not the contracts. The license just protected the right to keep showing up for them. I framed that clause not as a trophy. I framed it as a reminder that who you are on the good days determines what you have left on the bad ones. Bryce had everything, resources, relationships, a head start I gave him personally, and he chose to use it to cut the legs out from under the person who handed him the door. The consequences of that choice followed naturally, the way they always do when someone builds their position on what they took rather than what they earned. I'm not angry anymore. What I am is clear. Clear about what I built, what it cost, and what it was worth protecting.